Welcome to this episode of The Historytellers. Today we'll discuss the beginnings of the New World, from the shaping of North America to the earliest Americans. It all started several billion years ago, when a whirling speck of dust, fifth in size among the planets, became the Earth. About 6,000 years ago, only a minute in geological time, recorded history of the Western world began. Certain peoples of the Middle East, developing a primitive culture, gradually emerged from the haze of the past. Then, about 500 years ago, and a mere few seconds for the Earth, European explorers stumbled on the American continents. This dramatic accident forever altered the future of both the Old World and the New, and of Africa and Asia as well. Reporting today is analyst and correspondent, James Marshall. James, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. The shaping of North America was a time-consuming and detailed process. Planet Earth took on its present form slowly. Some 225 million years ago, a single supercontinent contained all the world's dry land. Then enormous chunks of terrain began to drift away from this colossal continent, opening the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, narrowing the Pacific Ocean, and forming the great landmasses of Eurasia, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, and the Americas. The existence of a single original continent has been proved in part by the discovery of nearly identical species of fish that swim today in the long-separated freshwater lakes of the various continents. The continual shifting and folding of the Earth's crust thrust up many mountain ranges. The Appalachian Mountain Range was probably formed even before continental separation, perhaps 350 million years ago. The majestic ranges of western North America, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, and the coastal ranges, arose much more recently, geologically speaking, between 135 million to 25 million years ago. They are truly America's mountains, since they were born after the continent took on its own, separate, geological identity. About 10 million years ago, nature had sculpted the basic geological shape of North America. The continent was anchored in its northeastern corner by the massive Canadian Shield, a zone locked in place by ancient rock, probably the first part of what became the North American landmass to have emerged above sea level. A narrow eastern coastal plain, or tidewater region, creased by many river valleys, sloped gently upward to the time-worn ridges of the Appalachians. Those ancient mountains, slanted away on their western side, into the huge mid-continental basin that rolled downward to the Mississippi Valley bottom, and then rose relentlessly to the towering peaks of the Rockies. From the Rocky Mountain crest, the roof of America, the land fell off jaggedly into the Intermountain Great Basin, bounded by the Rockies on the east and the Sierra and Cascade Ranges on the west. The valleys of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, along with the Willamette, Puget Sound Trough, seemed the interiors of present-day California, Oregon, and Washington. The land at last met the Pacific Ocean, where the coastal ranges rose steeply from the sea. Nature laid a chill hand over much of this terrain in the Great Ice Age, beginning about 2 million years ago. 2-mile-thick ice sheets crept from the polar regions to blanket parts of Europe, Asia, and the Americas. In North America, the Great Glaciers carpeted most of present-day Canada and the United States as far southward as a line stretching from Pennsylvania through the Ohio Country and the Dakotas to the Pacific Northwest. When the glaciers finally retreated about 10,000 years ago, they left the North American landscape transformed, and much as we know it today. The weight of the gargantuan ice mantle had depressed the level of the Canadian Shield. The grinding and flushing action of the moving and melting ice had scoured away the shield's topsoil, hitting its rocky surface with thousands of shallow depressions into which the melting glaciers flowed to form lakes. The same glacial action scooped out and filled the Great Lakes. They originally drained southward through the Mississippi River system to the Gulf of Mexico. When the melting ice unblocked the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, the lake water sought the St. Lawrence River outlet to the Atlantic Ocean, lowering the Great Lakes level and leaving the Missouri, Mississippi, Ohio system, to drain the enormous mid-continental basin between the Appalachians and the Rockies. Similarly, in the west, water from the melting glaciers filled sprawling Lake Bonneville, covering much of present-day Utah, Nevada, and Idaho. It drained to the Pacific Ocean through the Snake and Columbia River systems until diminishing rainfall from the ebbing ice cap lowered the water level, cutting off access to the Snake River outlet. Deprived of both inflow and drainage, the giant lake became a gradually shrinking inland sea. It grew increasingly saline, slowly evaporated, and left an arid, mineral-rich desert. Only the Great Salt Lake remained as a relic of Bonneville's former vastness. Today Lake Bonneville's ancient beaches are visible on mountainsides up to 1,000 feet above the dry floor of the Great Basin. For the Historytellers, I'm James Marshall.
James, as always, excellent reporting. You know, the Great Ice Age shaped more than the geological history of North America. It also contributed to the origins of the continent's human history. Though recent, and still highly controversial, evidence suggests that some early peoples may have reached the Americas in crude boats, most probably came by land. Around 35,000 years ago, the Ice Age congealed much of the world oceans into massive ice pack glaciers, lowering the level of the sea. As the sea level dropped, it exposed a land bridge connecting Eurasia with North America in the area of the present-day Bering Sea, between Siberia and Alaska. Across that bridge, probably following migratory herds of game, ventured small bands of nomadic Asian hunters, the immigrant ancestors of the Native Americans. They continued to trek across the Bering Isthmus for some 2,500 years, slowly populating the American continents. As the Ice Age ended and the glaciers melted, the sea level rose again, closing off the land bridge about 10,000 years ago. Nature barred the door to further immigration for many thousands of years, leaving this part of the human family marooned for thousands of years on the now isolated American continents. Time did not stand still for these original Americans. The same climatic warming that melted the ice and drowned the bridge to Eurasia gradually opened ice-free valleys through which nomadic bands moved their way southward and eastward across the Americas. Roaming slowly through this awesome wilderness, they eventually reached the far tip of South America, some 15,000 miles from Siberia. By the time Europeans arrived in America in 1492, an estimated 54 million people inhabited the two American continents. Over the centuries they split into countless tribes, evolved more than 2,000 separate languages, and developed many diverse religions, cultures, and ways of life. The Incas in Peru, the Mayans in Central America, and the Aztecs in central Mexico shaped massive sophisticated civilizations. Their advanced agricultural practices, based primarily on the cultivation of maize, fed large populations, perhaps as many as 20 million in Mexico alone. Although without large draft animals such as horses and oxen, and lacking even a simple technology of the wheel, these peoples built elaborate cities and carried on far-flung commerce. Talented mathematicians, they made strikingly accurate astronomical observations. The Aztecs also routinely sought the favor of their gods by offering human sacrifices, cutting the hearts out of the chests of living victims, who were often captives conquered in battle. By some accounts more than 5,000 people were ritually slaughtered to celebrate the crowning of one Aztec chieftain. It's a common tendency to think about these groups as belonging to one general group, all lumped into the category of Native Americans. But in reality, they were hundreds of independent civilizations, in many ways similar to the pre-Greek and Roman civilizations of Europe. It's in this light that our cultural reporter Elise Marie will introduce us to the earliest Americans. Elise, thank you. Your knowledge and insight are second to none.
Thank you, Jason. It's always a pleasure presenting for the Historytellers. Today, I want to talk about the earliest Americans. Agriculture, especially corn growing, accounted for the size and sophistication of the Native American civilizations in Mexico and South America. By 5000 BC, hunter-gatherers in highland Mexico developed a wild grass into the staple crop of corn, which became their staff of life and the foundation of the complex, centralized Aztec, Mayan, and Incan nation-states. Cultivation of corn spread across the Americas from the Mexican heartland. Everywhere it was planted, corn began to transform nomadic hunting tribes into settled agricultural villages, but this process went forward slowly and unevenly. Corn planting reached the present-day American Southwest by about 1200 BC and powerfully molded Pueblo culture. The Pueblo peoples in the Rio Grande Valley constructed intricate irrigation systems to water their cornfields. They were dwelling in villages of multi-storied, terraced buildings when Spanish explorers made contact with them in the 16th century. Corn cultivation reached other parts of North America considerably later. The timing of its arrival in different localities explains much about the relative rates of development of different Native American peoples. Throughout the continent to the north and east of the land of the Pueblos, social life was less elaborately developed. Indeed, societies in the modern sense of the word scarcely existed. No dense concentrations of population, or complex nation-states comparable to the Aztec Empire existed in North America outside of Mexico at the time of the Europeans' arrival. One of the reasons for the relative ease with which the European colonizers subdued the native North Americans, the mound builders of the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippian culture of the lower Midwest, and the desert-dwelling Anasazi peoples of the Southwest, did sustain some large settlements after the incorporation of corn planting into their way of life during the first millennium AD. The Mississippian settlement at Cahokia, near present-day East St. Louis, was at one time home to as many as 25,000 people. The Anasazi built an elaborate pueblo of more than 600 interconnected rooms at Chaco Canyon in modern-day New Mexico. But mysteriously, perhaps due to prolonged drought, all those ancient cultures had fallen into decline by about AD 1300. The cultivation of maize, as well as high-yielding strains of beans and squash, reached the southeastern Atlantic seaboard region of North America about AD 1000. These plants made possible three-sister farming, with beans growing on the trellis of the cornstalks and squash covering the planting mounds to retain moisture in the soil. The rich diet provided by this environmentally clever farming technique produced some of the highest population densities on the continent, among them the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee peoples. The Iroquois in the northeastern woodlands, inspired by a legendary leader named Hiawatha, in the 16th century created perhaps the closest North American approximation to the great nation-states of Mexico and Peru. The Iroquois Confederacy developed the political and organizational skills to sustain a robust military alliance that menaced its neighbors, Native American and European alike, for well over a century. But for the most part, the native peoples of North America were living in small, scattered, and impermanent settlements on the eve of the Europeans' arrival. In more settled agricultural groups, women tended the crops while men hunted, fished, gathered fuel, and cleared fields for planting. This pattern of life frequently conferred substantial authority on women, and many North American native peoples, including the Iroquois, who developed matrilineal cultures, in which power and possessions passed down the female side of the family line. Unlike the Europeans, who would soon arrive with the presumption that humans had dominion over the earth and with the technologies to alter the very face of the land, the Native Americans had neither the desire nor the means to manipulate nature aggressively. They revered the physical world and endowed nature with spiritual properties. Yet they did sometimes ignite massive forest fires, deliberately torching thousands of acres of trees to create better hunting habitats, especially for deer. This practice accounted for the open, park-like appearance of the eastern woodlands that so amazed early European explorers. But in a broad sense, the land did not feel the hand of the Native Americans upon it, mainly because they were so few in number. They were so thinly spread across the continent that vast areas were virtually untouched by human presence. In the fateful year 1492, probably no more than 4 million Native Americans ranged across the whispering, primeval forests and paddled across the sparkling waters of North America. They were blissfully unaware that the historic isolation of the Americas was about to end forever, as the land and the native peoples alike felt the full shock of the European discovery. For the Historytellers, I'm Elise Marie.
For all of us here at the Historytellers, thank you for watching part 1 of our 3-part series on the beginnings of the New World. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we look in depth at the European accidental discovery of the American continents, and the drastic consequences of first contact. For the Historytellers, I'm Jason Calvert. Be safe, and stay alert for wonder.